Harvest Home by Mark Spruce, written in 2020. This story recalls a special 2 weeks in the summer of 1981. Back then, I was just a 20-year-old. I was a loud, immature student at Portsmouth Polytechnic. A child, really, with bad clothes and a bad haircut. I was drinking far too much and flailing around in a semi-adult world, trying to find my place. Portsmouth was a large naval city, crowded urban streets, brutal post-war concrete architecture, and a seething mixture of sailors, students and locals. It was noisy, dirty, exciting and exhilarating. Charles and Di got married that summer. Raiders of the Lost Ark was on at the cinema. Riots had broken out in several cities, and the Challenger space shuttle took off on its maiden flight. The pace of life seemed fast, urban, exciting, and to some degree, frightening. I was trying hard to grow up and to find my way into the adult world. Meanwhile, my parents had moved at the start of the year to a tiny village on the northern edge of Dartmoor. This was around 100 miles away from Portsmouth, and in many ways it was 100 years away as well. At that time, the last dual carriageway heading west from Exeter came to an abrupt end after 20 miles at Widden Down. From then on, the road slunk around as twisting, turning single carriageways through exotic-sounding places like Owl's Foot, Sticklepath, and South Seal. The pace of life was immeasurably slower. Tradition, continuity, and isolation seemed to bind this world together. I remember visiting a local village pub where people sat on benches around the sides of an otherwise bare, low-ceilinged room. Two very elderly and hunched sisters served the customers ale from a jug they brought up from the cellar, and monies were kept in a pouch each carried tied on their aprons. An old courting couple sat on one bench holding hands, dressed in their finest Sunday best. He in a suit and she wearing an Easter bonnet with wildflowers in it. It was this world I found myself living in that long ago summer, a returning, impoverished and opinionated student. My mother kept ponies. Ponies need straw for bedding. Straw comes from harvested wheat and barley. A local farmer grew these cereals and my mother knew him. He needed an extra pair of hands for the summer harvest, and I found myself with a job. Life can sometimes be very simple indeed. Devon fields are rarely flat. They roll and crest as a seemingly never-ending sea of hills. Many are covered with rich green grass, but some are also ploughed for cereals. That first day of the harvest, I drove my mother's car down the remote winding track to the farm. Looking back, I cannot remember much about the buildings, but I do remember the farmer who was going to employ me, Peter Brown. More specifically, I remember his immeasurably thick, hairy forearms and the crushing handshake he gave me at our first meeting. That first day, I arrived at the farm as instructed at 11 a.m. There was no point in arriving any earlier, as the straw could not be baled until the sun had dried off the early morning dew. In the farmyard, Peter introduced me to the 3 men I would be working with. The youngest, John, was around 35. He was tall and thin, with a close-cropped beard and a peanut-shaped head. A friendly, jovial chap who had his own small farm not far from Peter's, where he ran a small flock of sheep and had a few meadows for hay. It did not provide enough income to support his family, and hence working for Peter during the harvest. Next came Billy, a squat, thick-set man in his late 40s to early 50s, a Devonian through and through, with the accompanying thick accent. Billy came from nearby Oakhampton. He seemed to have a great strength in him, and I imagined he could turn his hand to anything practical, though I learned later he possessed very little in the way of formal education. Billy had been helping out with the harvest at Peter's for over 20 years and knew the unchanging routines as well as his temporary boss. Both John and Billy shook my hand before I was lastly introduced to Varek. He was probably in his mid-60s then, but he seemed to me at the time far older to be still working on a harvest. Perhaps he drove the tractor, I thought, as he put out his hand to shake mine. The crushing strength of that handshake and the all-enveloping size of that hand made me quickly reassess Varek's abilities for the harvest. He had a dour and secretive face that was broad, with ruddy cheeks and deep-set eyes that assessed me coolly below thick bushy eyebrows and a full head of sandy-coloured hair. I immediately felt that on that first morning I would have far more to prove to Varek than to the others. A young college boy who would probably give in after his first day of harvesting, I imagined him thinking. To be honest, right at that moment, I was not too sure that he might be proven right. Below the naive optimism and ignorance there lurked in me a nagging self-doubt that I would be found wanting in this man's world. Peter's farm was ancient. Those sloping hills, high hedges and small fields were probably unchanged for hundreds of years. By 1981, modern post-war farming methods had swept away hundreds of small farms like this one. Many areas had ripped out hedgerows to create wide open fields. They had large gated field entrances to allow access to huge modern combines and tractors with air-conditioned sealed cabs, and all the latest technology of the time. That countryside was a world away from this farm. Peter went over to the barn and fired up the old grey Nuffield tractor. It had a rusty iron seat with the heaped entrails of orange baling twine stuffed beneath it. There was no roll bar, and the whole machine had a pervading smell of straw soaked in oil and red diesel. I would imagine it probably came off the production line in the early 1950s. The tractor revved a throaty diesel roar as Peter raised the old flat-8 grab that was attached to the front forks and drove it out into the yard to hitch it up to the hay cart. The hay cart was probably 25 feet long, with wooden boards on an iron frame to form its base, and large upright wooden trellises at either end to hold the straw bales in place. Everything on that old trailer was loose. The wooden boards were smoothed by time and over the years had worn large spaces between themselves through the movement of the trailer over those rough, hilly fields. The securing bolts rattled and clanged as the threadbare pneumatic tyres rolled over the rutted farm paths. Once the trailer was hitched, Billy quickly went into another barn across the courtyard and came back to us with 2 pitchforks. A few days before, I'd been playing Space Invaders in the arcade on Southsea seafront, blasting a relentless army of invading aliens. Now I was handed this medieval implement and told to jump onto the back of the trailer with the other men. Peter drove us out of the farmyard, down the track to the first field to begin the 1981 harvest. I had rarely to that point felt so out of my depth. A boy in a man's world, clutching his pitchfork. As we rattled and shook along the path in the July sunshine, I wondered if I would be able to keep up with these seasoned workers from another age who seemed so utterly at ease in this place and with the task ahead. We passed hedgerows thick with hawthorn under a clear blue sky as the tractor tyres raised a dust from the dry track. I looked at my companions, including Peter sitting ahead of us on the old tractor. All rolled confidently with the movement of the trailer, and all looked ahead in silence towards the first field of the harvest. I sensed all of them knew the size of the task ahead and the amount of sweat and effort it was going to take to achieve it. I had no idea what I was about to undertake, and my ignorance in that moment was quite unsettling. We arrived at our first field. The gate was open and broken, leaning at a drunken angle and held together mostly with orange baling twine. The tractor and trailer lurched through the gap on the rutted path. Ahead of me, I could see a rising slope with irregularly scattered straw bales all over it. As Peter drove up the field to the more level ground at the top, John suddenly said, "Come on, young'un, leave the pitchfork here. We're going to make up the eights." The tractor didn't bother to stop its slow ramble up the hill as I jumped down from the trailer to join John in the field. As the tractor pulled away from us, the noise decreased rapidly, and suddenly I was briefly aware of the birdsong in the hedges as the only sound to break the otherwise complete silence. I addressed myself to that first bale and that first task. John explained to me that we had to work our way across the field to gather the scattered bales together in groups of 8, 2 rows of 4 abreast. In a while, Peter would come back down the field on the unhitched tractor and pick up the batches of bales using the square metal grid with the curling iron hooks. The flat 8 grab. I approached my first bale, leant over it, curled my fingers around the 2 nylon twines and lifted it off the ground. The bale was heavier than I imagined, and the baling twine cut painfully into my fingers. I had to lean sideways to counter the weight of the bale as I walked towards John, with the bale banging uncomfortably on my side. If this was only bale number 1, the enormity of the task ahead suddenly and painfully became all too apparent. By the time I had carried my bale over to John, he had already grabbed and stacked 3 bales. Neither of us spoke as we concentrated at first on the task in hand, and after dropping my bale in the appropriate place in the stack, I walked hesitantly over to retrieve my next. This process continued for about 20 minutes, slowly and painfully for me, quickly and efficiently for John. Eventually, after dropping what already seemed like my 100th bale in the stack, I was about to trudge back for another when John stopped me. "God, you're making it hard for yourself going on like that," he said with a wide grin. "Look here and take a couple of tips." John showed me how, before picking up the bale, I should pull a small handful of straw into each hand and hold it under my palms as I slipped them under the twine to act as a cushion. Once I'd done that, he showed me how to pull the bale up in front of me to rest on my right front thigh, which then took a considerable part of the weight as I walked back to the stack. With these 2 gems of knowledge very gratefully received, I continued with John across the field. I was beginning to make quicker progress. I was now gathering maybe 2 bales instead of 1 for every 3 that he gathered. The sun beat down and we fell into a comfortable, unspoken routine. The sweat began to pour out of me. The muscles in my arms, legs and lower back began to ache. But the task quietly evolved its own steady rhythm. After a while, Peter came back down the hill with the flat 8 to begin taking the groups of bales up to the trailer. He stopped briefly by us and handed over an old lemonade bottle full of lukewarm water. I'd already worked up a tremendous thirst and gladly glugged down a good amount when the bottle was offered to me. John and I gradually worked our way up the field back towards the trailer, where I could see Billy and Varick stacking the bales skillfully in the lanes once they had been dropped by Peter from the flat 8. So this was the task. This was the harvest. This was my place in the team. It was hard work, but I now felt more at ease, knowing what I was expected to do, and to some degree, the proper way to do it. We arrived back at the trailer just as Peter lowered a set of 8 bales onto the ground at its wheels. The trailer was now almost full, with several lanes of tightly stacked bales in place. Billy and Varick stood on the top of the stack, where a gap in the bales had been left through the 2 top lanes. Varric looked down at me from the top of the stack, with legs astride and hands on his hips.
The flat 8 is not able to reach the top lane, so we pitch the last bales, yes?
Okay, I said.
Now, you can get the pitchfork and throw up the first bale,
said Varric, with a far from benevolent smile. The other men looked at me as I leaned over to pick up one of the pitchforks. That gap in the bales must be at least 12 feet high. How on earth was I meant to get a bale up there? With quite a lot of trepidation, and under the watchful eyes of the 4 men, I plunged the pitchfork into the middle of the nearest bale, and with arms in front of me, lifted it up to chest height. Oh, come on! These guys are taking the mickey. There's no way you can get a bale up that high, I thought, as I sweated and struggled at the foot of the stack.
Come on, put your back into it,
said Varric, and the others made varying and unhelpful comments about eating 3 shredded wheat and youthful energies being misspent on amorous activities. I was a pretty strong young man by that age, but there was no way I could lift that bale any higher. I let the bale drop to the resounding laughter of the gathered men. I felt defeated and humiliated. Immediately, John leaned forward with the other pitchfork, plunged it into a bale, and before I knew it, had flung it with apparent ease towards the waiting hands of Varric and Billy. John's actions just added to my sense of defeat, and in that moment my earlier feelings of well-being and bonhomie towards my fellow workers disappeared. It might also have been at that moment that the lifetime problems with my lower back began. Maybe I had come across a bit too cocksure earlier, a bit too educated student know-it-all. I hadn't meant to be, but now I was certainly getting my comeuppance. Maybe this was a rite of passage for all first-time harvesters. Or maybe Varric was just a mean old vindictive bastard. At that moment, I wasn't sure. It was John once again who showed me with the next bale how to lift and throw it properly. Pitchfork well into the centre of the bale. Grasp the shaft right next to the prongs and lift it into your body whilst bending your knees. When the pitchfork is vertical and with the bale just above your head, straighten your legs and at the same time thrust your arms straight upwards, propelling the bale up to the receiving hands of the men on the top of the stack. It was hard, back-breaking work. As the bale rose above my head, straw fell down onto me and found its way inside my shirt to stick uncomfortably to my sweating chest. I barely got my first bales up there, but with practice I improved until that top lane had been completed. Varric and Billy climbed down off the cart to rope down the stack, and Varric came over to me where I was standing exhausted and breathing heavily in the shade of the trailer.
See, you did okay in the end. We will make a farmer of you one day, maybe, yes?
He said to me in his thick Eastern European accent. Thanks, Varric, was all I could mutter at that moment as the sweat ran into my eyes and my breathing gradually returned to normal. The stack roped down, Peter rehitched the tractor. Varric and Billy rode on the tail bar, and the 3 of them set off down the hill slowly back to the barn to unload. I looked across at the area of field we had already cleared, at the millions of stubble straws standing in neat rows like an immense silent army drawn to attention. Then I looked over to the fields all around us, some covered in bales waiting to be stacked, and in the far distance some barley still waiting to be cut. We'd loaded our first trailer, but I could see there was so much more left to do.
Come on, young'un, let's be getting on,
said John, breaking me out of my reflective moment. We continued on across the field, stacking the bales in groups of 8, and gradually we began to talk. John asked me about my life, and at the same time opened up a little about his. I was aware that this was not an adult and child talking, but two men having an adult conversation, full of banter and good humour, and I remember really enjoying it. I had been tested by these men, and so far had not given up. I had earned a small amount of respect, and in turn was certainly learning to respect their knowledge of old farming techniques. I discovered John and I had a common love of music, and he told me how one of his best memories was seeing The Who perform in Plymouth back in the mid-1960s. He'd gone to the concert with a young Peter Brown and his stunning girlfriend, with the white miniskirt and white thigh-length leather boots. I got the impression Peter's then girlfriend had made a lasting and lustful impression on John, and in that moment I saw him as a young man of my age, and not the middle-aged father of two toddlers.
"Oh, those boots, I'll never forget 'em," said John, stopping for a moment and shutting his eyes to reminisce.
"Do you know what happened to her?" I asked.
"Oh, he married her.
"You'll probably see her later on today or tomorrow when she brings the kids back from school," he replied. I must admit, I felt slightly shocked at my co-worker's blatant expression of lust towards his boss's wife, but I suppose it was refreshingly earthy and honest. "What about Billy? Have you known him for long?" I asked.
Billy, he's lived round Oakie all his life. Left school at 14 and has kept himself going with odd jobs ever since. Nice man, but I wouldn't ever lend him any money if he asks. He likes the ponies. He's got a string of kiddies by different women round town. He's good to work with, but I wouldn't want to marry him." "Ha!" said John with a chuckle.
"And what about Varick? Is he just over for the summer from Europe somewhere?"
"Varick? No, boy. He's been here since the war.
Escaped from Poland, I think. Works at the dairy over Hatherley and takes his 2 weeks holiday here every summer doing the harvest with Peter," replied John. I could not imagine anyone ever wanting to do this work as their summer holiday, and at that moment he seemed even more foreign than he had previously. That first day finally finished around 8 p.m, and I drove home utterly exhausted. I remember managing to have a hot bath and crawling into bed, aching from head to foot. How on earth would I be able to drag myself over here tomorrow? Somehow, with tired limbs, I managed to drive my way back to Peter's farm the following day, and for the days after that during that glorious July fortnight. I moved from bale collecting to cart stacking to tractor driving and eventually to having a go on the flat 8 grab. I got fitter and stronger and more skilled as I bedded in as a member of that tight little team. The days passed in an endless succession. The weather remained fine and gradually the fields emptied. The barns filled until late one afternoon we found ourselves loading the very last trailer. By now I could pitch a bale as well as any of them and confidently flung my last bale up to Varick on the top of the stack. We tied down that last trailer and I expected we would all then head off back to the farm. It was with some surprise when the others all sat down in the shade of the trailer and I was invited to join them.
"Here she come, perfect timing," said Peter in his thick Devon burr.
I looked down the hill to see an old faded green minivan crawling up towards us across the stubble. When it had almost reached us, a woman got out who I realised was Peter's wife. Somehow our paths had not crossed during the previous 2 weeks, and I looked at her now to see a tall, slim woman with long, straight, dark hair in her late 30s. She was not at all the image of the typical farmer's wife I would have imagined. In that moment I could also imagine her in thigh-length white leather boots and completely understood John's lustful memories. As we sat and watched, she went around to the back of the minivan and Peter went over to meet her. They walked back towards the 4 of us, with Peter's wife carrying a large tray covered with a red gingham tablecloth. Peter was also carrying something, a large old-fashioned stone jug with wide corked stopper. Peter and his wife sat down next to us on the stubble. The tablecloth was laid down, and on it was placed an oval plate of homemade Devon pasties. At a rough guess, there was enough for all of us to have had 3 each. Peter's wife produced 6 glasses from the van, and with some effort, Peter pulled the thick cork from the stone jug to fill the glasses with cloudy amber Devon cider.
"Help yourselves, lads,"
said Peter, as we all leaned forward to take a glass and a pasty. I was about to greedily gulp down my unexpected but much appreciated pint when John lightly touched my arm to tell me just to wait a moment. Peter then told us all to raise our glasses before he said, "Thank you, Lord, for helping us to bring this year's harvest safely home.
To the harvest home!"
At that, we all raised our glasses and repeated the toast. Over the next hour or so, we ate pasties, drank cider, shared stories, jokes and laughter. We all got pleasantly mellow as we sat there in the late afternoon sunshine with a bucolic view of the Devon countryside spread out before us. I was one of the men, one of the team, and I really felt like I belonged. Looking back so many years later, that remembered scene could almost have been from 1881 rather than 1981. It's so easy to recall because it's still so firmly implanted in my memory. Should I ever begin to forget, then the twinge in my lower back will probably remind me of it.
Spruce Casts, an eclectic collection of anecdotes, reflections and stories by Mark Spruce.